Hey guys, this is Coach Adrian with Blitz Kids. Today what we're going to do is go over the game of the week. Alright, so this was actually a game that I was playing. I was playing the black pieces. My opponent was playing the white pieces. And today's topic, the reason why I chose this game was because here we're going to see that my opponent chooses a very unorthodox type of opening, or a very weird or strange type of opening. And we hear these principles, control the center, activate those pieces, and make sure that the king is safe at the beginning of the game or throughout the game. But we're going to see why, how to tackle someone that is playing a very weird or strange opening. And I know we have lots of questions, lots of problems whenever we're tackling these types of players, because we know no theory. We don't know any theory, and we're just completely lost on where to go. So again, I was playing the black pieces. My opponent was playing the white pieces, and we're going to see how I approach this. And you'll see that I approach it in a very logical manner. So the first move was pawn to b4. Again, I'm playing the black pieces, guys. I do not play b4. Matter of fact, before this, I didn't know what it was even called. Like, it was this an opening or not. But here, we see after my opponent plays b4, what I do is fall back on my concrete opening principles, which is pawn to e5. Pawn to e5, again, just striving for the center here, doing very good to take over that d4 square. And my opponent plays bishop to b2, and here, notice that e5 also attacked here on b4. So my opponent is saying, okay, well, if you take me, I'm going to take you on e5. And my opponent's going to say, well, the e5 square is more important than the b4 pawn. So it's kind of like a trade-off. But I actually do take it, and I'll tell you why. I see that I can develop my knight to c6 with the gain of tempo here. And if I have an open e-file, then I could potentially castle quick, and then you utilize that e-file to take over the initiative. So already I'm thinking further ahead than my opponent, okay, I take you, you take me mentality. And we don't want to have that mentality. We have to have a concrete idea, a concrete plan on what we're going to do with this. So my opponent takes. I follow up with knight f6. I can't play knight f6 right away. Or sorry, I can't play knight c6 right away because bishop takes g7. So don't want to play that, right? But after bishop takes, knight f6, my opponent plays a3. So I'm already in a very weird type of opening. Like, I've never played this before. It's very tricky, right? He has some ideas of, okay, well, I'm attacking this bishop. If the bishop retreats to e7, then it gets passive. If it retreats to, let's say, c5, then maybe d4 will come. And so I ultimately decided bishop a5 was the best move, blocking this a pawn from moving any further, keeping the pressure or the d pawn pinned to the king on e1, and I want to just keep it as active as possible. You see, here's another rule. If you have to move the same piece twice in the opening, you want to put it or place it on its best square possible. So if you have to retreat, put it on the square that it's going to make the most use of itself. So pawn to c4 was played by my opponent. This gains space on the queen side, also opens up potential tactical possibilities. Like, let's say, I move this d pawn forward, there'll always be this queen a4 check, checking the king and attacking the bishop. So I got to be careful about that as well. And it's also just keeping watch of this square d5. So my opponent does have some logic behind this very weird, unorthodox opening. So I play knight to c6 to gain that tempo that I was promised in the opening. And here my opponent goes back. Now the computer points out that d5, I actually don't have the engine on, but I did analyze this before making this video. And so it has some suggestions. It says d5 is a possible road or route to take. I like the path that I chose, but d5 is a possibility, so I will kind of go through it. So d5, c takes d5, queen takes d5, and now knight to c3. And this is probably the main reason why I didn't play this, because the knight on c3 is going to tempo that queen on d5. And here, I mean, it's okay. Queen d6, it's not like I lose my queen. Knight f3, castle, and we see that I have the open d file, the open e file to utilize or work with, and my pieces are very nicely developed. There's no problems whatsoever. I have 2 open bishops, 2 open files, very easy development. I mean, this is just the dream position. And white will have 2 pawns in the center. So this is actually pretty important, because now you guys are actually seeing how I'm play against the center rather than have the center, because sometimes your opponent will have the center and you'll be playing against it. And this happens especially in these weird, strange openings. You don't know exactly the best path to choose, so you might trade off a center pawn or 2. Now I decided to, even though this is very active and this is very interesting, I decided against this, and I decided to play castle kingside. So d5 was definitely a choice there, but by castling, I can still reserve this option of playing pawn to d5. So pawn e3, rook e8, knight f3, pawn to d5. Now I play it, and it's interesting. I put my rook on the open e file here first to put pressure and prevent or dissuade my opponent from playing pawn to e4, because now I could just take it. Another thing is, now that my opponent plays e3, a more passive type of move, he's preparing to play d4. And so what I want to do is, before he plays d4, I want to go in on this square. So now we're starting to see a plan start to emerge from this opening. You see, your opponent may have some type of advantage as far as knowledge. He has the book, because he's playing some weird opening. You've never seen it before. You have no idea what you're doing. However, your opponent will know what they're doing. Oh, if he plays this, I can play this. If he plays there, I can play there. So basically what I'm doing is falling back on my principles, and something, a weakness or a square of importance will come about, and that's whenever I start to really form a plan as much as possible. So I try to keep it as concrete as possible, but at the beginning you're just kind of fighting over key squares. But now we can see that this d3 square is starting to spur up a little bit, and my active pieces are going to give me a good chance to seize the initiative or seize the attack. I'm going to be the one kind of calling the shots. Notice his development is very poor. He had to, because he played this b4 pawn, now I'm able to develop my pieces very quickly. So he only has 1 piece developed. I have 1, 2, 3, and 4 pieces developed. And that's why I decided after knight f3, I played d5. So again, reserving that option for a little bit later. And this is exactly what I do. So he plays bishop e2, and this is actually a critical moment already. So what do I do with this d pawn, right? Do I take here, or do I push forward, or do I just develop and ignore that? Then I could go to g4 or f5. And I really decided that this bishop here was good on f5, but only if the d file was open. And if I have it on f5, then I'll be controlling this square. Now, you'll probably say, well, this is kind of a faulty type of logic, because your opponent could always play, let's say, pawn to d4. This is true. My opponent can play this. But if he plays d4, now he blocks in his bishop on b2, and it doesn't really make sense for the bishop to be on b2. So here we go. I actually played d takes c4, opening up that d file, and now I have direct sights over d3, and this forces my opponent, or prevents my opponent from recapturing, or sorry, castling immediately. He needs to recapture first. But I think he probably could play castle. Then I'd probably have to play b5. But then if you play like a4, then you undermine this. So this could be a possibility here. This could be a possible route or scenario that my opponent could take. Instead, he played bishop takes c4. I played bishop f5. Now my pieces are starting to coordinate together and converge onto d3 square. And now you can see that my opponent, if he doesn't play d4, bishop d3 is coming. And this knight could very well find itself going or plopping itself not on d2 but d3 there. So all of my pieces are actually converging nicely. So we have castle, and one route highlighted in blue by the computer is queen e7, and now d4, and again we're just having influence over the e4 square. And this is probably a more logical way to continue, or an easier way to continue for black, because I really do have a lot of pressure down here on the e-file. I decided to play knight g4, which is pretty interesting because, again, I'm trying to go for this d3 square, but I'm also provoking maybe a weakness over here. And if he plays h3, now I can play knight to e5. So again, I'm developing, I'm following all of the principles, and no, I will not have the best opening ever. However, I will have a good middle game prospects. So I have good middle game prospects because I fell back on those principles. So we can see how the game turns into, the board just starts going on flames, because like really my opponent starts attacking me whenever he wasn't fully developed, and then I started counterattacking, and then things got out of whack. But I just really wanted to show how the opening phase, even if you don't know how to handle unnatural openings, or you don't know the theory behind them, you can just fall back on those principles, which is activate your pieces, be safe with your king, and control that center. And sooner or later, because every opening has a drawback. No opening is perfect. That's something to remember. And so if you just wait and really analyze the board, especially those center squares, something will come about. Okay, he may have this, this, and this, but I have the d3 square. And that's what I'm aiming for. That's what I'm constructing my plan around, because I'm reading the board, dissecting it, and going for his Achilles heel. So that's very important here. Just slow down a little bit, absorb the board whenever your opponent plays an unnatural opening. So my opponent plays h3, and now I play knight to e5, so I reroute, and again I'm aiming for this square, and I'm also tempoing on this bishop, and I do get a couple of trades in. So another point that I wanted to say is that this bishop on b2 I feel is very important to my opponent. Notice how he never played d4. That kind of struck out to me. This is more psychology than anything, because I was thinking that my opponent really favored his bishop pair, and so he had to make this decision, this ultimate decision, to actually part ways with this bishop. You see, since he never played d4, that told me he really wanted these two open bishops to attack on the king side. So what I did was block out this diagonal and offer or propose a trade of bishop for knight. So you have two defenders, and he has two attackers, and my rook is gonna be on the e5 square, and then he can play this d4 move to tempo the rook. So it's a bit enticing for my opponent to do that, because he's going to gain the center, gain space, and tempo my rook at the same time. But the problem is, if he tries that, now he gives up his bishop pair, and then my queen may very well come along this diagonal and take residence down here. So this would be the h8 to a1 diagonal, and then we could see the diagonal gets weak. Alright, and some of this stuff does happen. So after knight ge5, he takes, I take, and he takes. So he parts ways with his bishop, and I take, and now I have the bishop pair. So now that my advantage goes from okay, this d3 square is a bit weak, which I still have a bit, it's a bit weak still. Now it's, my pieces are very active. My rook is going to be able to come over and win this. Now, one thing that my opponent played was queen b3. And so now he's like, oh, this is a very strong attack. This is true. It is a very strong attack. However, notice how his pieces are not all working together. So I really thought about this position for a while. And I was like, okay, he shouldn't be attacking right now because his development isn't finished yet. So how can I punish this? You know, sometimes your opponent plays tactics, but tactics favor the person that has a better position. And I'm the one with the better position here, so he should not be attacking here. So I decided to play queen to f6. And I wonder if anybody could see the idea behind queen f6. So take a moment, think about how I would respond with queen takes b7. Alright, so my opponent did not play knight c3. He did play this queen takes b7, but before we do that, let's entertain knight c3. This is the computer line that gives black still an equal position, if not a little bit better. So knight c3, king h8, or sorry, b5, knight takes, and now bishop takes h3, g takes, and since the queen and the knight are both on the queen side, or all other pieces for that matter are on the queen side, I'm able to play rook g5 and queen f3. So we have two attackers to pretty much zero defenders, so white would have to play rook g1 in order to defend, but this is good enough for a draw. I can play queen f3 and so on and so forth, and that should be a draw. But I wasn't really interested in a draw, so that was something that I probably wouldn't play anyways. I would probably just continue bringing in my pieces like this rook over here. So after queen f6, knight c3, I would probably play something like bishop to b6, or just swing my rook across. Maybe even king h8 is an idea, or bishop g6 was probably a little bit better. Bishop g6, just covering this f7 square, and just continue to fight. Continue to fight for those key squares. Okay, so my opponent plays queen takes b7. So if you got the response to this, congratulations, you're really a good chess player, because this move here I had to think about for a little while. It looks like a good move. Initially my knee-jerk reaction was, okay, get the next piece into the action, but there's actually a stronger move here in this position, and that is bishop to e4. So this is the key move that turns the tide of the battle. First of all, this diagonal is key. I'm counterattacking on the queen on b7, and now my bishop is attacking on g2, and so I have three pieces on the attack on the king side. Zero defenders, queen is hit, and this rook can easily come into the attack. And another secret threat, the reason why I played queen f6 back on, let's say, move 15, is that, yes, I was protecting the f7 square, but I was also getting ready for a discovery attack. So us really strong players, what we really want to do, or what we do naturally, is that we may defend your attack, but we also place the piece where we're going to continue our attack, or continue our agenda, our plan. So that's why I played queen to f6 here. So going back, after bishop to e4, my opponent is in a lot of trouble here. A lot of trouble. So he plays queen to a6. After which I play rook to g5. And here, this is a very strong move, because first of all, I'm threatening rook takes g2 with check. And also queen takes a1. And my opponent has to be really careful here. So the first move to meet both threats looks like, oh, well, just queen takes queen. But this gets refuted by rook takes g2. And after king to h1, this sets up a windmill, so now I can actually play rook takes f2 check, and after king to g1, rook to g2 check, king h1, and now this nice little move, g takes f6, and now I still have the windmill, and I can just continue with that attack. If my opponent plays something like rook takes f6, threatening bishop takes f7, or rook takes f7, I also have rook to g6 discovery attack. So this would be really lethal. Now my opponent has a nice move if I try to continue right away. So like if I play rook takes f2, check, king to g1, and now let's say I play rook g2, king h1, and now let's say I play rook takes d2. Now my opponent has queen f3, and this basically doesn't do much for me. So this would not be as good. So I have to be a little patient, and after g takes f6, then I can continue the attack. Alright, so that's the first major threat. Now the second one is just playing queen takes here. Like if he plays, you know, knight to c3, then I play rook takes g2, but if he protects against this threat, let's say g3, then I can play queen takes a1. And this is what my opponent does. He plays f3, not necessarily g3, but f3 to block out this diagonal. And again, this counterattack is really strong because he didn't develop all of his pieces. His rook is still in the corner, and the only reason why it's unprotected is because he didn't develop this knight. This type of tactic would not be present if he developed all of his pieces. So here, I play queen takes a1, and the rest of the game is just kind of, you know, mopping up. But I do play here queen b2. And queen b2, I think, wasn't the best move because here, as the computer points out, he could have played h4, and if I get off of, let's say, if I get off the 5th rank, let's say I play rook to g6, then he can play queen takes a5. So queen takes a5 would just win some material back. And if I go along this rank, then I have less pressure against g2, and I'm pretty sure he can just dislodge this rook off of the 5th rank anyway. So no matter what I play, let's say I play here, he can again just dislodge it and win the bishop back. Or if let's say I play rook here, then again he can dislodge it with d4. So either way, this bishop is really in a bind here. So just queen takes a5. Alright, so that was his one way to kind of get back at me. He didn't, however, play that move. Instead, he played bishop takes f7 because there was a discovery attack whenever he captured my bishop here. So whenever he captures, yeah, that opens up the bishop and the rook to make connection here. So there is some attack for my opponent here kind of going, but it's not nearly enough to compensate because he didn't develop those pieces. So queen to b2 was played, and here he played bishop takes f7, and this is just better for me because after king to h8, he plays bishop to d5, and here I just play bishop takes d2. So I continue the attack, and the idea is now he can't capture here because this is going to lead to mate. Bishop takes king h2 or h1, doesn't matter, and now queen to g2, checkmate. My opponent instead plays queen e2, and I know you see the bar go all the way up. That means that this was a blunder. This bar is kind of indicating who is better. So if it's black, that means I'm doing better. If it's white, if it goes all the way down, that means my opponent's doing better. But here my opponent makes a big mistake. Who can tell me what the best move is in this position? So my opponent didn't want to play like knight takes d2, even though this is a strong move. And the reason why is because I continue to attack on g2, and at the very least it's annoying. So like rook f2 for instance, then I have here, if rook f1, then queen takes e3 check. That's a possibility. Probably the best move is just queen takes e3 right away, because now that I'm looking at it, my opponent has, after queen check, he has queen to f1. So queen takes e3 would have to be played. But yeah, this doesn't look too good because bishop takes a8. So instead, maybe best is to play maybe it's after rook f2 we could play okay, so we could play this move, and after this move we go into an endgame where we're actually better. So we would play, you know, something like rook and just call it a day, or even take open file. All of this is good. It's tricky though. I could say that white has a pretty good defense here. I'm actually pretty curious. Let's see what the best move is here after queen takes d2 with the computer. Yeah, the computer likes queen to c1, the move that I suggested. It's kind of going back and forth between queen e1 and queen c1. And after queen c1, queen takes, go into the ending, and then play, it says rook c8 here. It says rook c8. I like rook d8 personally. Rook b8 is also a possibility. Yeah, all of these are pretty good moves. Tricky though, tricky, because he's gonna have this pass pawn business going down. So yeah, I'm just -1 here. Alright, so let me shut that back off and let's go back into it. So queen e2, go ahead and pause your videos, think about the best move. Alright, here I played bishop takes e3, and this basically makes my opponent resign in a couple of moves, because he can't take, because I still have queen takes g2. And if he moves out of the way, let's say here, then I have queen takes e2. So my opponent opts for, after bishop takes e3, he opts for rook f2. And now, the killer move, queen takes e2. My opponent resigns. And for good reason. If he captures, he can't, because the bishop is pinned. Or the bishop is pinning the rook to the king. So this just goes to show you that whenever your opponent plays an unorthodox opening, you don't have to strive for a completely flawless opening. The opening should be just to set up your pieces. So it's not like you're trying to just checkmate your opponent, because remember there's 3 phases, and the opening phase of the game is not for attacking. So instead what you do is just set up your pieces, but it has to make sense. Notice how I coordinated my pieces. So around, I want to say around this time, we can just jump to it right here. This was kind of a pivotal moment for me to play d takes c4, to eyeball the d3 square and have the open files, and just go for open play, open piece play. So here, bishop f5 makes sense with that. Knight g4 even kind of makes sense. Something better again was queen e7, just controlling e4. This was more cohesive. This was, you know, in the spirit of d takes c4. But what I played was fine. And now, yeah, alright, take, and just notice all of the pieces are actually coordinating together. So it's not just about, okay, fall on the principles. That's rule number 1, but rule number 2 is it has to make sense. You have to make it make sense. And the only way you're going to do that is if you have clear targets. And here my target was d3, and I noticed that my bishop, or my opponent's bishop pair, was trying to aim down here, down the sides on the king side. So he really wanted this king to kind of come out over here, and I was thinking that he was probably going to play this, but I'm not too sure. Like, he could have played maybe queen h5, provoke g6, and then make this bishop stronger. But since he gave up the bishop pair, this is whenever the tide of the battle had turned, and I was successful in refuting his unnatural opening. Now, the third thing is after the game. Well, first, you want to, while you're playing the game, form that plan and see if your idea holds up after the game. So you want to analyze it with maybe a stronger player or coach, and you want to see if your plan was any good. So I blocked out my opponent's plan, by blocking out the diagonal by having the knight on e5. And at the same time, I was going for the d3 square, right? And I had to open files to maybe play against the e pawn and d pawn, which is, you know, hard to conduct in itself, but it was a fight that I'm willing to make. So anyways, you want to go back and review your game. That's important, especially with the openings that you do not know. You want to go back and see what the opening name is, so you can actually look it up and learn the main line and see why the main line is the main line, and see the idea that your opponent was trying to implement, even if you win, because sometimes your opponent could have made a pivotal mistake, and really, if you would have made that right move, you would have been in a lot of trouble. So you still want to go over it, and you're more likely to make a mistake in an opening that you do not know than an opening that you do know. So opening that you do know, at least you're going to play somewhat decent moves, but an opening you don't know, it's all original. It's all creativity from your brain. So that's why you want to go over it. And I learned that this was called the Polish opening. So that's one thing that I learned after this game. B4 is definitely not one of those great games or great openings, but it could be tricky against players. And we can see that this game got really out of control really fast. But just knowing the knowledge that I know, knowing that you need to develop first before you start your attack, I was able to maintain my confidence in the game. I could have easily, after queen b3, where's queen b3 at? Move 15 for white. He played queen b3. I could have easily collapsed under pressure. I could have easily said, oh man, I'm lost. I'm losing a pawn. He's either picking up on f7 or he's picking up on b7, and that's game over. No, I didn't lose faith. I didn't lose hope. I kept my confidence going because I knew the principles of the game here. So I knew that he can't attack with two pieces. That just doesn't make sense. Something's off. Something's amiss here. And the computer shows that even a couple of moves later, here, that I could have even played, after knight c3, his best option to continue developing. I could have even played b5 here because my development was so strong. And this would, at the very least, gave me a draw. Alright guys, so I hope you learned something today. How to handle unnatural openings, fall back on those principles, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you.